this is what launching a game looked like. You built your game, you launched your game, and that was it. And then you worked on the next game. However, things have changed, and this is what it looks like nowadays. It's not enough to just build your game anymore. You have to build your game, build operations tools, launch your game, have a backend, have servers, and then once a game launches, it begins this continuous cycle of the post-launch operations phase, where you're analyzing data about your game, you're doing customer service for your live game, you're constantly analyzing who your customers are, generating events, making offers and promotions, gathering more information, updating your content, and so forth. It's a continuous cycle that never ends once your game goes live. And if you're building a live game, this portion is almost more important than the game itself in some cases, because you're able to, one of the benefits of a live game is you have the opportunity to continually update and edit your game post-launch. So when I talk about live ops, I'm specifically talking about things you do after your game goes live that you can do without changing the game code itself. I'm not talking about updates to the game. I'm talking about everything you can do without having to change the game. So that includes things like items you add to the catalog, a limited time offer in your store, events like a weekend event, a user acquisition campaign. I'm not talking about things that require a new update to Apple or a new submission to Google or the player to download a new version of the game. So we're talking just about the things you can do without those kinds of code changes. If you're going to have effective live ops, though, you have to have tools. Because one of the most important questions is, what can you do to change your game without having to go and bother the engineers? A lot of game companies require their company, to do live events, you do things like hacking the database or editing raw SQL queries. That's not a good way to do things. You really want to try and make your operations team able to do things without having to do and talk to these engineers. And so what I've found is the best live game operations guys they have this total hacker mentality. They're really good at figuring out how to make changes in ways that were never expected. So on one end of the spectrum, they're doing things like writing SQL and hacking the database. On the other end of the spectrum, they actually have tools and they have all the variables and knobs and levers they need to actually tweak the game post-launch. So these are some components of live ops. Events, business intelligence, being able to add offers and promotions in your store to try to boost sales of your in-game, managing the catalog of items for sale, doing good customer service to players who call in or have problems, and user acquisition. Today, we're only talking about events. Events is, I think, in some ways the most important, because if you're only going to do one thing in your game post-launch, think about events. So what are events? What do I mean by events? I mean this. If you've ever been to Disney, how many people here have been to Disney World or Disneyland? Okay? Some of you? If you go to Disneyland at Christmas time, it looks like this. They make all sorts of changes to it. They have special lights, they have special parades, they have fake snow, they have, like, everything changes. And Disney's really good at this. They're constantly changing and tweaking the theme park based on the time of year. At Halloween, they have a very different set of decorations. Why? Because they want you to keep coming back. And if you've just been to Disneyland, why would you want to come back a year later? There are not that many new rides. It's because they've tried to add new content and new things to keep it fresh and interesting and exciting. And that's exactly what events do for your game. Events are ways to keep your game fresh and interesting and exciting to encourage your players to come back and spend more time in the game. I was first introduced to the power of events when I was working and living in Japan. Or rather, I was working in Shanghai, and I was managing PopCap's Japan operation. This is the revenue history of Tetris Blitz, one of the games that PopCap's Japan team launched. And you can see this graph, the revenue was constantly going up and down in the rankings. They were not making any changes to the core game itself. All of these changes in revenue were entirely driven by in-game events that they were launching and operating in the game. It can have a huge impact on the profitability of a game. So let's talk about some examples of the kinds of events you can think about. I've got 6 different categories we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about fun events. We're going to talk about monetization events that are specifically designed for monetary reasons. We're going to talk about marketing events designed to kind of boost awareness and boost people visiting your game. Content events specifically designed to kind of drive usage of new content. Tactical events, my favorite, which are an event you're creating with a very specific purpose in mind, almost like a scalpel. And finally, a mixture of all the above. So all events start with a calendar. You want to have an editorial calendar where you've plotted out over time the kinds of events you're going to be running and when. And this is an actual event calendar from a trading card game in Japan. This is a FIFA trading card game run by EA. And you can see that at any given time, they have 5 or 6 different events going on, and they're constantly changing. And so a game like a trading card game or a game that is really dependent on heavy player engagement will have many, many events going on in parallel, right? It's not like one event every month. It's more like several events every week. And what they actually did was they not only had all these events, they actually would forecast ahead of time what they thought the impact of each event was going to be on the core KPIs, and then they would measure the actual results and use that to help them calibrate the effects going forward. So at the bottom, you can see where they're actually tracking the ongoing effects of KPIs. So when you're thinking about the kinds of events to create, it is helpful to think about the kinds of players you have in your game. Because if everyone's here, this is something called Bartle's player type. It's a well-known tool of game design where on the 2 axes they have acting versus interacting, and they have world versus players, and they have these 4 different characteristics of different types of players. So some players love to basically go out there and troll and kill other players. Some players love to achieve and earn recognition. Some players like to be friendly and socialize and interact with other players. And some players like to explore and try out new experiences and have new adventures. A good game covers all the different bases, and a good mixture of events cover all the bases. So when you're planning your event calendar, think about what kind of events do I have for each of the different player types who might be playing my game. Another thing to think about is there's a big difference in my mind between what I call the event mechanic and the event fiction. So I don't know if you can read that. The event mechanic is what is actually changing in your game during a typical event. So if you look, for example, at the first one here from, I believe these are all from Puzzle Dragon. If you look at the first one here, this is called the Ultimate Dragon Rush event. And it's basically a special dungeon. And this special dungeon is only available for a limited amount of time. And all players who clear the special dungeon get a special reward. That's it. Special dungeon being released, limited time. But that's not that. But the way they kind of position it to players, the fiction, you can read there. The skies are ominous. The earth trembles beneath our feet. Behold, the legendary dragons come forth, and so on and so forth. They've created this fiction around what's essentially just a new dungeon they've added. And the goal is to not just communicate these mechanics, but to make them more interesting to players. And that's important because when you're trying to sell events to players, you want to put them in the context of the fiction of the world to make them interesting and make them exciting. And especially with games in very savvy markets like Japan, you'll find websites that track in exhausting detail all the events being run and when they're being run. And games will often even tell their players, hey, this weekend from 5 p.m. on Friday until 10 p.m. on Sunday, there's this new event running, and here's the exact details of exactly what's changing. So let's talk now about some of the different types of events. So the first type of event is what I call a fun event. A fun event is there purely to drive player engagement and to give players something fun to do. And often these can be done with no changes whatsoever to the game itself. These can be done entirely based on operations tools. So let's take, for example, a hide and seek event. So the GM will post on a blog that the GM is hiding somewhere in the game world, and they say, please take a screenshot of yourself visiting the GM and post that screenshot to a forum. And this is a cool event because it does not require any sort of preparation. All you need is the ability to have a world where players can visit and take a screenshot and post it to a game forum. It does not require special analytics or special tools, just a forum where players can post photos. Another example of a fun event is some screenshot categories. This is a game called Terra Online from En Masse Entertainment. And they actually have in anticipation of Valentine's Day, they have a pickup line contest where the goal is to basically come up with the best pickup lines and go to a certain spot in the world at a certain time and try out your pickup lines. And so again, it's an example of a fun event. Doesn't affect the game performance. Doesn't give you special rewards. It's just a fun way to engage with your players. So then we have monetization events. And so monetization event examples are events that are specifically designed to try to drive and boost revenue. So we can imagine a battle card game or trading card game that has just released a new set of cards called the Death Dragon set. And you can imagine they have a special map that appears very rarely and only if you happen to have one of these special cards equipped. So they might have a limited time event where they're saying, hey, this new dungeon is only going to appear during this limited time and only if you have a particular card equipped. And then they might then have a special package they sell in the store, a limited time only package with special cards. And they're hoping to convince players to buy these special cards in order to experience the special content. Another type of event might be a spender rewards week where they're creating, for a limited time only, they're creating escalating tiers of prizes that you receive for spending certain amounts of money. So let me show you some examples of these. So on the left here we have from Gaia Online. This is one of those tiered events where the more money you spend, the special rewards you receive. And this is all very limited time. And on the right we have an example of a crafting event where the goal is to encourage players to use up all their raw materials. So let's say they're about to launch a new dungeon or some new area of the world, and they want to reduce the inventory in the world of crafting materials. And so you have a special event where for a limited time only, the crafting percentage goes up. So players are encouraged to do more crafting because there's a higher chance of success, and that's going to drain the world of these crafting materials, so when they launch the new content, people have to go and restock all their materials and spend more money. A content event might be an example where there's a new dungeon being announced, and so you want to encourage players to go visit the new dungeon, and so you might announce things like the boss loot drop rate is going to be higher. So you have an incentive to go visit the dungeon for this week because there's this new because the loot rate is tripled. Marketing event examples, this is where you might be cross-promoting a game with other games. And so I have an example here from a company called NinjaBee. They had 3 games they wanted to promote, and so they actually had unique content in each game related to the other games. And so if you did something in one game, you might get an item in another game and vice versa. Tactical events are my favorite because they're the most interesting and in some ways the hardest to understand. A tactical event is where you have a very specific goal of why you're running the event, and again, you're wielding it very specifically. So imagine you have an MMO strategy game where you can imagine you're tracking your level. You happen to know that there's a relationship between level and revenue, that the higher the player level they reach, the higher the player's LTV in the game, or the revenue for the lifetime of that player. And then let's say you're measuring players by cohort, and you happen to notice that your current week 5 cohort is not leveling up as fast as historically it would level up. So for some reason, your current week 5 cohort of players is only about half the level, only half of them are at level 10 compared to where they should be. So how are you going to fix that? Well, what you might choose to do is have a new event targeted only at that week 5 cohort of players, where you're telling these players, hey, for a limited time only, we're tripling the XP rate. And by tripling the experience rate, you're encouraging those players to play more during that limited time and level up and basically kind of get back on track with where the other players should be. So that's an example of an event specifically designed to get a certain cohort back on track. Another example might be an empire building game where you've used up your user acquisition budget. There's not as many players in the system, and so the number of new players coming in is fairly low. And because the number of new players coming in is low, there's not as many players to battle against. And so what you want to do is you want to level them up as fast as possible to get them out of the low-level ranks into the higher-level ranks where there's more players for them to battle against. And therefore, you need to do a limited-time event to try to get your low-level players leveled up more quickly to compete with the higher-level players. But you don't want to permanently change your leveling curves, because if you do that permanently, you forever ruin the balance of your game. And if later you decide to put more budget against user acquisition, then you've kind of permanently ruined your game. So that's where an event is perfect. Create a limited time event targeted at your players, designed to level them up faster. It's limited, and you can kind of get them up faster without permanently ruining the whole curve of your game. So in order to pull off these kinds of events, here are some of the technology building blocks you need to have in your game system. You have to have a really good BI system, so you actually can understand what's going on and understand who your cohorts are and where they are in the game lifecycle. You have to have the ability to localize content, because if you're running events on a global game and you're launching your event on a Thursday and you're creating on a Monday, you've got to get all that content localized in 3 or 4 days. You've got to have great messaging tools so that you can tell your players what's going on and actually tell them about the events that are coming up. You have to have the ability to do gifting and awarding. And the most common event is one where at the end of the event period, players who did really well receive a prize. And so you have to have a way of measuring at the end of the event period who did well and then give those players the prize that you promised them. So you might have a new dungeon and say for all players who finish the dungeon by the end of the weekend, you get some rare item in the game. You have to have the ability to actually follow through and award that item. You have to have the ability to target and segment and target different events for different groups of your players, especially if you're doing sort of the targeted events I mentioned. And you have to have the ability to change game variables. It doesn't help if you want to have an event which is, for 1 week only, you're tripling the rate of XP. It doesn't help if you don't actually have the mechanism to actually triple the XP. So you have to have those variables exposed on the server where you can change them and have them affect in the game. So let's talk about each of these. In terms of BI, good business intelligence, good game analytics is really, really hard. This is why there's so many analytics companies out there trying to compete for analytics, because it's really hard to do. Most databases are optimized for reads, not writes. And yet most BI for games is all about the writes, not the reads. Because if you think about the game, you're constantly dumping data nonstop, and then you're not actually analyzing it very often. And so that's a very inverse pattern for how most databases are designed. And when you are doing a read, you're analyzing all the data. You want to say things like, I want to know how many of my players are level 10. Well, that requires touching every single player in your entire database to figure that out. And so that's why there are specialized data warehouse solutions like Amazon Redshift specifically targeted for this kind of thing. Localization boosts revenue by 30–40%, but it's not enough to just localize the game. You now have to localize all of your events. So that's one of the challenges you have to figure out for your operation strategy. Push notifications. When you talk about how you're going to tell players what's going on, push notifications are one of the best ways of telling players, hey, this weekend, special event coming up, tune in for it. In-store promotions. If you're going to have a store in your game where you're selling items, you're going to want to have an ability here to tell your players about special events coming up. So, here's an example where they're promoting certain items are 50% off during certain periods of time or during certain event types. You want to have maybe interstitial ads that pop up during the gameplay, again, to tell players about different offers or events that are going on. Social media messaging. A lot of games use social media channels to tell their community what's going on. So they'll offer posts on things like Facebook or Twitter saying, hey, this weekend is a cool event. Come back and check it out. I have a friend here from a retargeting company. Retargeting would be a really good way to put ads out on the internet to tell players about a special event coming up, especially players who might have been a lapsed player. They're bored of your game. They've maxed out their level. There's no more content for them. That's a perfect time to have a re-engagement event to try to get that player to come back to your game and re-engage, and that's where a retargeting ad, for example, can be very successful. Most games have community websites. Community websites are a great place to talk about events going on. For example, I believe on the right there we have World of Warcraft, which has an entire calendar in the website talking about upcoming events. Most games have a message of the day launcher. So when you run the game, you have an opportunity to pop up telling the player about any upcoming events that are happening soon that they might want to tune in for and learn about. Many games have chat windows. Chat windows are another great place to put upcoming events. So you have your chat of other players, and you can have a little ticker at the top saying, hey, by the way, new event coming, check it out. In-game mailboxes, the ability to send messages to players in-game, so when they log in, there's messages waiting for them from you, the game administrator, telling them about what's coming up. And then finally, the ability with your analytics system to go in and slice and dice your players and figure out segmentation and then target events and messaging to certain players. And then going back to those gaming variables, you've got to have all these variables exposed on the server side, so you have the ability to change things. Like, ask yourself, how many of the variables in my game can I change from the server? Can I change XP drops or the loot drop tables or how quickly energy recharges? And more importantly, not just can I change it, but can I change it for a limited time, and can I change it for a limited set of players? So not just change it for everyone, but change it only for a certain segment of players. That's the really hard challenge, because most games can't do that. Okay, that was it. Incredibly fast-paced tour through some of the things to think about with live games. You're welcome to send me email if you if you don't have a chance to ask me a question today. I should say, in the interest of kind of disclosure, my company makes technologies for live game operations. We have tools to do a lot of things I just mentioned. And so if that's at all interesting and you don't want to build your own servers or build your own infrastructure, that's sort of what we do. So with that, I'd love to open it for questions.
So I'm guessing you have some sort of service that has like real-time monitoring of statistics, like analytics, right? Is there a possibility to see that?
Sure.
Now?
Yeah, if you want. So we have two different things. We have our actual tool where you can go in and, let me just a second here. And you can go in and sort of do things like measuring reports on sort of what's going on inside your game. This is actually not that interesting. Where it really gets interesting is things like this. So we have real-time measures of all sorts of stats like player installs, things like inventory. Oh, sorry. Thank you. You're not seeing this, are you? Let's do that. Yeah, so this is an example where I'm showing you, this is the actual data dashboards that our own team uses to monitor our service. So you can see things like player installs, items granted and consumed by players, virtual currency added, subtracted in the game world, errors we're seeing, player purchase transactions, let's see, reports being generated. These are the kind of real-time metrics we track on a kind of minute-by-minute basis. We actually don't make these available to our customers yet, but we will be. This is currently just our own view of the system. What our customers see looks more like this. This is basically the kinds of reports we generate that let you track of what's going on inside your game on a daily basis. And then it's also always good to have an analytics solution where, for example, you can go in and view an actual event history of every single event actually happening in a game for your players. So you can go in and for example, let me show you what an event log looks like. So you can actually go in and actually see what's going on for your players so you can then later slice and dice it to do targeting.
Do you have any advice about how far ahead you should plan in terms of coming up with events in case something goes wrong and you need to shoehorn something in to address it?
Yeah, so most companies I know of have different calendars. They've got a content calendar, and the content calendar in some cases is 3 or even 4 months out, where they're planning way ahead what kind of new content they're creating and when the new content will be released, because that has the longest lead time. The event calendar, usually I don't see event calendars being planned out more than a month in advance, because you want to be continually changing your event calendar based on what you're learning. And so you don't want to get too far ahead of your planning, because you want to be able to adapt quickly to what's actually going on in your game as you experience it. So going back to the example of EA, they typically planned about a month out, and they had events kind of pre-planned ahead of time, so they knew what they were going to do and when. Yeah. So the question is, if you've decided that a certain cohort of players needs some change, and you're going to use an event to try to make that change happen, do you run that event just targeted at a cohort or targeted at all your players? It's a good question. In general, to be honest with you, most companies I talk to don't like to do targeted events because other players find out about it and get pissed off that they weren't invited to the event. Sometimes they'll do it for VIP. I mean, it's common to have maybe VIP events that are only when your VIP players or your whales or something, and they do that in part to encourage players to become VIPs. But in general, no, it's not a good idea to target events just at a certain cohort. But what you can do is you can craft the event so it's open to everyone, but only the particular cohort is basically going to find it useful. So a good example might be, again, if the challenge is your players aren't leveling up to level 10 fast enough, what you might do is specifically drop, or you might say something like, okay, all level 10 castles are now going to build 4 times faster. And so what you're changing the build rate of a very particular item in this particular empire builder, which really only affects the players that matter to you. So that won't have an effect on the higher level players, but it has the desired effect of getting that one particular cohort leveled up faster.
Does this event kind of format works with all kinds of games? Is just the premium, those kind of games that which engages the players more, not like casual games or something like that?
Oh no, events work with all kinds of games. I mean, back when I was at PopCap, we ran Bejeweled Blitz, which is one of the most casual games you can imagine on Facebook, and they had 2 or 3 different events all the time. They had happy hour events, they had weekend events, they had Thanksgiving events. I mean, they had lots of different events being planned. Obviously, with a very casual game, there's not as many things you can do in the event. I mean, in a role-playing game, you have an entire world to play with. In a casual game like a Bejeweled Blitz, you might only have a few levers to pull, but they pull the levers. You know, an event can be as simple as, you know, coins are 20% off between 5 and 6 o'clock every day. That's an example of a happy hour event, which is designed to encourage people to come back between 5 and 6 o'clock every day. You know, they might have an event where they change the drop rate. You know, this weekend, magic gems are going to be appearing twice as often as usual, you know, again, to try to get that engagement level.